The night has fallen, and the world outside has grown silent. This is the time for stories that can only be told in the dark. Welcome to the Dark Hour. I am Pan, your narrator. The Midnight Visitor. The November fog clung to the carriage like a damp shroud. Arthur, a young lawyer from London, wondered if he was wandering inside a nightmare. The fog wasn't merely vapor. It swirled, forming grotesque shapes, mute faces screaming before dissolving the moment he tried to look straight at them. When the dark silhouette of Greywood Keep emerged, the horse let out a terrified whinny, nearly overturning the carriage. "This is as far as I go, sir," the coachman stammered, hastily tossing Arthur's bag onto the muddy path. His voice trembled with fear. "I won't go in. God save your soul. They say that place no longer belongs to this world." He turned his cart and lashed the horse into a frantic gallop, vanishing into the fog, leaving Arthur alone before the great iron gates. Arthur approached the oak door. The knocker was not a lion's head, but an Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own tail with an expression of strange agony. Before Arthur could even raise his hand, the massive door swung open. It didn't creak. It opened with a weary, mournful sigh of rotten wood, as though the house itself were reluctantly exhaling a cold breath. The air inside was thick and motionless, and immediately Arthur heard them. The whispers. They came from no particular direction, slipping past his ears from all sides in a language he couldn't comprehend, like dry parchment rubbing together. A figure detached itself from the darkness of the hall. It was a gaunt man in a worn surgical coat. The sharp scent of disinfectant filled the air, but beneath it, Arthur caught a faintly sweet, putrid odor, the smell of rotting lilies. "Dr. Anselm," he introduced himself in a flat voice. The strangest thing was the light. A single candle burned on a nearby table, casting Arthur's shadow in a trembling dance upon the wall. Yet, curiously, Dr. Anselm's shadow barely existed, only a faint smudge beneath his feet, utterly disproportionate to his frame. "We do not receive guests," Anselm said, his eyes hollow. "But you are here. The blood of von Hessler, though diluted, must still be welcomed." Arthur shuddered. "How do you know—" "Your scent," Anselm interrupted. "We can smell our own." He turned away. "Be careful where you step. Do not disturb what rests in the dark corners." Arthur followed, trying to ignore the whispers that now seemed to murmur his name. He glanced into the drawing room. Dozens of clocks, grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, wall clocks, all ticking. One great ebony clock in the corner was ticking backward. "Madame Isolde awaits," Anselm announced as they reached the staircase, where a woman in deep mourning stood still as a statue, her face veiled in black. She did not move, but as Arthur approached, a small silver music box in her hand clicked open on its own. A shrill, broken melody filled the air, and Arthur felt a sudden pain in his head, as if the sound were scratching the inside of his skull. "Madame Isolde welcomes you," Anselm translated the eerie tune. "She says you've arrived just in time for the ritual." "I'm tired," Arthur stammered, feeling his consciousness blur, not from exhaustion, but from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. "Good," said Anselm, and for the first time he smiled, a smile that stretched his pale skin unnaturally. "Fatigue will make it easier for you to see." "See what?" "The midnight visitor. It's hungry," Anselm said.
Arthur swallowed hard, his throat burning with disgust. A shiver like an electric current ran down his spine. "Always," Anselm replied, his voice steady, ticking like a dying clock. He took up the lone candle, its weak flame barely lighting a few steps ahead, leaving the rest of the great hall swallowed by darkness. "Follow me, and do not fall behind. The corridors dislike strangers lingering." They began ascending the main staircase. The red velvet carpet beneath Arthur's feet was strangely soft and damp, as though he were stepping on moss. The whispers grew louder, clinging to him, brushing the back of his neck like icy fingers. As they passed a wide corridor on the second floor, a pair of double doors stood slightly ajar, revealing part of a ballroom. Arthur glanced inside. The room was empty, save for two figures, twins, a man and a woman, about 30 years old, dressed identically in ashen gray. They were kneeling on the floor. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of dried beetles, moths, and spiders were meticulously arranged across the wooden floor, forming an enormous galactic map, intricate to the point of madness. The twins, Casimir and Lenora, as Arthur would later learn, moved in perfect synchrony. Not a word was spoken. Casimir's hand placed a gleaming black scorpion. Instantly, Lenora's hand set down a lunar moth beside it. The dry, brittle clicking of chitin against wood was the only sound in the room. They didn't lift their heads. They barely seemed to breathe. "What are they doing?" Arthur whispered, unable to tear his eyes from the scene, so precise yet so deranged. "Preparing," Anselm said without stopping. "They're charting the path. The visitor hates to lose its way." The madness of this place was so thick Arthur could taste it, the tang of rusted metal and ancient dust. At last, Anselm stopped before a heavy door at the end of a corridor that seemed to stretch longer with every step they took. He opened it, revealing a vast bedroom. Furniture lay beneath white sheets, like tombstones of a forgotten parlor. Only the great four-poster bed in the center remained uncovered, its linen pristine, so clean that only under the candlelight could one see the fine dust clinging to its corners. "Your room," Anselm said, setting the candle on the bedside table. "Rest, counselor, but do not sleep." "That's absurd," Arthur growled, exhaustion and fear finally flaring into anger. "I'm a lawyer here on legal business. I won't take part in any deranged sick game of your family's." Anselm turned back, his face mere inches from Arthur's. The reek of rotting lilies hit Arthur so strongly he nearly retched. "A game," Anselm repeated, and for the first time something like amusement crept into his voice. "You think this is a game?" He pointed toward the large embroidered tapestry hanging on the opposite wall. It depicted a medieval hunting feast, but as Arthur squinted at it in the candlelight, he noticed something strange. The hunters weren't carrying spears. They held instruments resembling twisted musical tools. And what they hunted was not deer or boar. It was a vast, formless shadow, covered in countless crimson eyes, all sewn in silk. "We are the Dream Keepers, Mr. Arthur. The von Hessler we bloodline made a pact centuries ago. We keep it imprisoned within its own dream in exchange for existence. But the price is eternal wakefulness. And if we sleep, if all of us fall into slumber, the nightmare will be freed. It will become reality." "That's the most insane thing I've ever heard." "Is it?" Anselm smiled, revealing his yellowed teeth. "Then go on. Try it. Sleep deeply, rational young lawyer. Dinner will be served in the dining hall. But if you don't come down," he glanced toward the carpet, "the meal will come to you." Anselm stepped back and slammed the heavy door shut. Arthur rushed forward, twisting the handle. It was locked from the outside. The sound of Anselm's footsteps faded down the corridor. Arthur was alone in the cold room. He stared at the bed. It looked so inviting, so soft. He was utterly exhausted after 2 days of travel. But when he looked into the tall, clouded mirror in the corner, he saw his own reflection. And for a brief, fleeting second, something else standing directly behind him, a towering, formless shadow, black and solid, radiating nothing but an endless hunger. Arthur spun around. Nothing there. The ticking of dozens of clocks out in the hallway seemed to count backwards. He had to stay awake. At any cost, he had to stay awake.
Time inside Greywood Keep seemed to obey no law. Arthur stared at the single candle, forcing himself to count each drop of melting wax, turning it into a mental exercise to fend off the heavy, suffocating pull of sleep. He had tried everything. He had paced the room, the only sound being his own footsteps on the wooden floor, until he realized even that sound seemed foreign, discordant in Greywood Keep's twisted symphony. From beyond the door came the uneven ticking of dozens of clocks, creating a chaotic rhythm, a kind of inverted hypnosis that stretched his nerves to the point of breaking. From below, Madame Isilday's shrill, broken music box played again and again, repeating the same fractured melody. From above, the ceaseless clicking of the twins and their insect collection echoed like hail on a rooftop. And from deep beneath the foundations came a steady, pulsing thrum, the sound of machinery, of some engine coming to life. Dr. Anselm had begun his work. The entire manor seemed to vibrate, not with fear, but with a feverish vigilance. The ritual had truly begun. "This is auditory torture," Arthur muttered, clutching his head. "They're doing it on purpose, psychological conditioning." He slumped into the velvet armchair. It was dangerously soft. His eyelids dropped just for a moment. He was in a forest. Fog swirled around his legs. He heard voices whispering his name, but not Arthur. They were calling something older, a name that felt terribly familiar. Towering silhouettes glided past him, their breath icy cold, reeking of blood and decay. He felt thousands of invisible ants crawling across his skin, biting into his flesh. Pain raced up his spine and into his skull. Arthur jolted awake, heart hammering. He had fallen asleep, only for a few seconds, but the room had changed. It was colder now. So cold he could see his breath. The candle still burned, but its flame had turned a pale blue, trembling as though afraid. And the
The stench of rotting lilies filled the room so completely that Arthur had to cover his nose. It wasn't seeping through the cracks of the door, it was in the room, as if someone had shattered a vial of funeral perfume beside him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. Silence answered him, but no, not silence. A scratching sound. It didn't come from the door. It came from inside the wall, right behind the tapestry of the hunting feast. A slow, deliberate scrape, as though something enormous was dragging its claws through the old plaster. Arthur backed away, eyes fixed on the tapestry. The embroidery seemed to bulge outward, the threads strained. The crimson eyes of the shadow on the tapestry appeared to glow in the blue light. "Just a hallucination, sleep deprivation," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. Then he heard it, right beside his ear, a wet, rasping sigh, just behind his neck. "Sleep. We are so tired." The voice wasn't Anselm's, it wasn't Isilday's. It was a chorus of countless whispers echoing from his own throat. He screamed and leapt to his feet. He grabbed the heavy brass ashtray from the table, the only weapon within reach, and spun around. No one. But the cold had deepened, biting into his bones. The candle sputtered out, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for a faint trickle of moonlight through the window. And in that darkness, Arthur heard a new sound. It came from just beyond the locked door. Not footsteps, not human movement. A slick, heavy, slithering noise. Something wet dragging itself along the corridor, mixed with the faint, brittle click of joints shifting. Arthur held his breath, pressing himself against the icy wall. He remembered Anselm's warning. If you don't come down, the meal will come to you. The slithering stopped right outside his door. Silence fell again. A silence so absolute, so alive, it was worse than any sound before. Arthur stared at the brass doorknob. It didn't move, but the iron lock was slowly, deliberately unlatching itself from the other side. The heavy iron latch clicked dryly, then slowly, decisively, flipped up. The lock was open. Arthur's heart seemed to stop. He glued his eyes to the door, the brass ashtray in his hand now absurdly heavy and useless. He held his breath, listening to the pounding of his own heart in his chest. The air in the room thickened, suffocating, as if every molecule of oxygen had been sucked out. The door didn't open right away. Instead, it began to creak open, millimeter by millimeter. A small, ghastly screech from the dry hinge pierced the silence.
pitch-black gap appeared. Arthur stepped back, his back slamming into the wall. He couldn't take his eyes off that gap. The first thing that came through was the smell. A stench of rotten lilies and millennial dust burst forth, so strong it made him gag. The second was darkness. Not merely the absence of light, but a blackness thick as ink, oozing through the crack like viscous liquid. It spread across the floor, devouring the faint moonlight. And within that spreading darkness, Arthur saw them. The eyes. Not two, dozens. Red, pupilless eyes bulging with pure malice, glaring at him. No eyelids, no shape, just glowing orbs of hatred, reflecting his own terror. "We are hungry," a voice echoed from the corner of the room behind the mirror. Now it was a cacophony of ghostly, chaotic sounds reverberating throughout the room. The faint light from the window was gone. Beneath Arthur's feet, the floorboards began to crack with sharp snaps. This time, the voice wasn't in his head. It came from the shadow, crawling toward him. The door was now wider open. The midnight guest had begun. It had no fixed shape. It was a chaos of nightmare fragments. Part of it like a giant spider with long, spindly legs made of shadow. Part of it like drifting wet seaweed, and at its center, something resembling a mouth, gaping wide, filled with uneven, jagged teeth. He screamed, a cry strangled by terror. He swung the ashtray toward the dark mass. Whoosh! The ashtray flew through the guest, as if through air, but not entirely. When it touched the shadow, a hiss, like acid on metal, rang out, and the ashtray dropped to the floor, its brass bubbling and discoloring instantly. No, the ashtray couldn't hit the floor. It was pulled into the shadow and vanished. Arthur realized a horrifying truth. This thing wasn't a physical being as he understood it. It was a hole, a void, an emptiness starving for existence. The shadow convulsed, red eyes focusing on him, and it lunged. Arthur had nowhere left to run. In a frenzy of panic, he did the only thing he could. He charged toward the window. At that moment, from beneath the house, a shrill mechanical scream tore through the air, overpowering the whispers. It was Anselm's machine, roaring to its peak, like a massive saw blade striking metal. Bang! Simultaneously, Mrs. Isolde's music box in the hallway blared twice as loud, its melody twisting into a metallic scream. The guest recoiled. The shadow jerked backward as it burned. The red eyes flickered in fury. It turned, if it could be said to have a head, toward the hallway, seemingly distracted by the noise. The machine howled again. The shadow hissed, like 1,000 serpents, and retreated from the room, slithering back down the hall, the darkness ebbing like a receding tide. The door slammed shut with tremendous force, shaking the walls. Arthur stood there, gasping, cold sweat pouring down. He stared at the door. The latch clicked. The door was locked again, from the outside. He understood. That hadn't been an attack. It was a test. Perhaps just an appetizer. And then he realized something worse. The ritual wasn't madness meant to keep the thing out. It was an elaborate, deafening ritual to lure it around the house, to keep it busy, to feed it small things, so it wouldn't focus all its tension on one person. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't a lawyer. He was bait. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, human ones this time. A key turned in the lock. The door opened. Dr. Anselm stood there, his pale face lit by candlelight. He glanced at Arthur, then at the floor where the shadow had receded. "It seems," Anselm said in that chillingly even voice, "you've met the guest. Good. Now you understand. Tonight it only tasted.
Tomorrow night it will want to feed. He jerked his head toward the corridor, down to the dining room. The real dinner is waiting.
The panic had passed, leaving behind a cold paralysis. Arthur followed Anselm like a machine, his legs stiff. The brass ashtray was gone, leaving only a black, bubbling mark on the wooden floor. The only proof that he hadn't imagined it. The corridor was now eerily quiet. The machinery beneath the cellar had softened into a steady thrum. The twins' clicking had stopped. Even Isolde's music box had gone silent. The entire manor seemed to be digesting its light meal. Anselm led him down a narrow spiral staircase toward what appeared to be the eastern wing of the estate, a place even older. The air was thick with dampness and something else, the smell of raw meat. They reached a pair of ebony double doors. Anselm didn't knock. He pushed them open. It was the dining room. And it was a scene torn straight from the fever dream of a madman. The room was vast, its ceiling soaring into shadow. A long oak dining table dominated the space, large enough to seat at least 30. But only 4 people sat there. Matron Isolde was at the head of the table, still veiled in black, motionless like a crow standing guard. Her music box rested quietly beside her plate. The twins, Casimir and Lenora, sat side by side. They weren't looking at anyone, only at their empty silver plates, their hands moving in a blur as they communicated in rapid sign language. And opposite them sat a tall man Arthur hadn't seen since arriving at the castle. The feast was lavish. Black candles burned in tarnished silver holders, their flames flickering with an eerie green hue that cast writhing shadows on the walls. And the food. A massive roasted suckling pig lay at the center of the table, its skin glistening. But when Arthur looked closer, he saw its eyes were not olives, but 2 amber marbles, glowing faintly. The silver platters were piled high with strange meats, some pale blue, others a deep violet. A large bowl held something like soup, but it was thick and black as crude oil. "Sit," Anselm ordered, pointing to the empty chair across from the twins. Arthur hesitantly pulled it out. It was heavy. The moment he sat down, as if on cue, the 4 others simultaneously lifted their knives and forks. No one spoke. They began to eat. The only sound was the shrill scrape of metal cutlery on silver plates. Matron Isolde, with an unnervingly graceful motion, lifted her food beneath her veil. Anselm chewed mechanically, his empty eyes fixed on the wall behind Arthur. But the strangest were the twins. They weren't eating. They were cutting the blue meat into tiny geometric shapes, precise, intricate. They arranged them into mirrored patterns, then mixed them up and began again, a meaningless, haunting ritual. Arthur stared at his own empty plate. Hunger gnawed at him, but the thought of swallowing anything from that table made his stomach twist. "You must eat," Anselm's voice broke the silence. I'm not hungry," Arthur lied. "That wasn't a suggestion." Anselm set his fork down with a sharp clang. "You are part of the bloodline. You must partake. That is the law." Matron Isolde lifted her head. She wasn't looking at Arthur. She was looking at another empty chair, at the far end of the table, opposite her, as though an invisible host was seated there. Arthur understood then, this wasn't dinner. This was the feast of the lost ones he had heard about. "Eat," Anselm repeated, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat. "It needs our strength. If we grow weak, it grows strong. Eating is not to feed us, it is to contain it." Lenora, the twin sister, suddenly froze. She looked up, meeting Arthur's eyes for the first time. Her eyes were completely blank. No pupils, only milky white. She slowly raised a finger and pointed, not at Arthur, but at the empty space right beside him. Arthur went rigid. He could feel it. A sudden shift in the air. A familiar coldness gathering in the vacant chair next to him. The whisper returned, faint but very close. "Thank you for the invitation." Matron Isolde reached out and opened her music box. The shrill melody began again, like a warning. "Don't pay attention to it," Anselm hissed. "Just eat." An invisible hand, cold as ice, brushed against Arthur's neck. He screamed and leapt from his chair, knocking it over. The entire von Hessler family stopped. They all turned their heads toward him. 4 faces, one hidden, one vacant, 2 hollow, stared at him in cold reproach. They weren't angry because he was afraid. They were angry because he had interrupted the guests' meal. Arthur's sudden movement was like a stone hurled into a sick, motionless pond. Madness rippled outward. Matron Isabel's music box snapped shut. The silence in the dining hall grew thick and suffocating. The cold presence beside Arthur vanished instantly, but the fear did not. "You've offended it," Ansem whispered, his voice no longer detached but filled with a frigid fury. He wasn't looking at Arthur. His gaze was fixed on the empty chair at the head of the table where the invisible host resided. Matron Isolde slowly rose. Her tall, gaunt frame loomed terrifyingly beneath her mourning gown. She said nothing. She simply lifted one gloved, bony finger and pointed toward a large portrait hanging above the fireplace, one Arthur hadn't noticed before. It was the portrait of a man in dark armor, with a thick beard and wild black eyes. He looked eerily similar to Anselm, but it wasn't the man who caught Arthur's attention. It was the thing standing beside him in the painting. Rendered faintly, almost transparent, was a tall black figure with indistinct features save for the countless crimson eyes scattered across its shape. Von Hessler ancestor rested a hand upon the shoulder of the guest as though it were a loyal pet. The ancestor, Ansem said, as if reading Arthur's thoughts, the first to make the pact. He invited it in. He believed it was a god of ancient knowledge, a being from the darkness between the stars. He was wrong. Ansem stood, pushing his chair back. He thought he could control it. He bound it to our bloodline. It granted us longevity. Do you see Matron Isolde? She's nearly 140. But in return, it consumes our souls, and it must be fed. Fed with what? Arthur stammered, backing toward the door. With fear, Ansem replied. With wakefulness, and sometimes with careless guests. The twins, Casimir and Lenora, raised their heads simultaneously. In a voice that was one and the same, sharp and brittle as breaking glass, they spoke for the first time Arthur had ever heard them. Guests must stay. Guests must keep the dream. They rose, milky white eyes locked on Arthur, moving around the table toward him, their motions jerky, unnatural, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. You won't keep me here, Arthur shouted, lunging for the doorknob. It didn't budge. You don't understand, do you? Ansem's voice now echoed with a sick kind of pity. Poor little lawyer. You thought you came here to read a will. Ansem laughed, a dry, choking laugh. There is no will. The last Baron von Hessler is you. What? What are you saying? Our bloodline has rotted. Only the mad remain. Matron Isolde, the twins, and myself. We are so very tired. Ansem stepped forward, pulling from his coat a glass and metal syringe filled with a cloudy liquid. We have kept the dream too long. Nearly 150 years. It's time to rest. It needs a new keeper of the dream. Someone with strong blood. Someone whose reason is still intact, so it can be lost. And you? Arthur gasped, fighting against their grip. We? Ansem smiled, a true smile for the first time. We will finally sleep. Forever. He stepped closer. Lifting the syringe, Arthur saw his own warped reflection in the cloudy liquid. Do not fear, Ansem whispered, the stench of rotting lilies heavy on his breath. It only hurts at first. The pain of your soul being torn apart and replaced by the guest. The needle came closer to Arthur's neck. He shut his eyes, bracing for the plunge, and then bang, bang, bang. A thunderous sound erupted from the main hall, not from inside. Someone or something was pounding on the front door. All 4 members of the von Hessler family froze. They looked at each other, not afraid, but utterly bewildered. Impossible, Ansem muttered, the needle hovering mere inches from Arthur's throat. No one comes here, ever. Bang, bang, bang. The blows grew louder, shaking the entire manor. And then, over the howling wind, a voice thundered from outside. "Open up in the name of justice! We know you're in there, von Hessler! Open this door now!" The twins' grip loosened for a moment, just a flicker of hesitation, but it was enough. Arthur acted on instinct. He roared, driving his elbow backward with all his strength, striking Casimir square in the chest. A dry crack of bone echoed. At the same moment, he tore his hand free from Lenora's grasp, used the syringe in Anselm's hand as leverage, and shoved the doctor away. The syringe flew from Anselm's grasp, spitting through the air. The milky liquid splattered. Some of it sprang across Anselm's face. "Arr!" the doctor screamed, not in pain, but in fury. The liquid seemed to eat into his skin, hissing white where it touched. "You fool!" Anselm shrieked, clutching his face. "You've wasted it! The only serum for the transfer!" Bang! Bang! The pounding at the front hall grew more violent. The twins didn't care about the intruders. They only cared about Arthur. Their milky eyes flared with pure rage as they lunged for him. Arthur wasted no time. He sprinted toward the large window at the end of the dining room, a huge pane of glass thick with dust overlooking a crumbling balcony. He grabbed a heavy oak armchair and with every ounce of strength left in him, hurled it at the window. Crash! The glass exploded, a storm of razor-sharp shards raining down. The freezing air rushed in, carrying the howls of wind and sleet. Arthur dove through the shattered frame, his boots grinding into the glass that sliced through his shoes and trousers. Adrenaline drowned out the pain. He landed on the stone balcony, nearly slipping on moss-slicked stone. Below him, about 20 feet down, was an overgrown courtyard, a way out. He heard the twins growling behind him. They were climbing through the broken window, heedless of the glass. They moved with an unnatural grace. Arthur glanced down. He saw them. At the front door. It wasn't police nor rescuers. It was a crowd of figures in black robes holding torches and pitchforks, an angry mob out of the Middle Ages. They were battering the front door with a great log. "Catch him!" Anselm's rasping voice thundered from the dining room. He was clutching his burned face. "He must not escape. If he leaves, the guest will be freed." Arthur felt horror sink in. He didn't know who was worse, the von Hesslers trying to turn him into a vessel, the guest lurking in the shadows, or the mob breaking in. Casimir lunged, seizing Arthur's coat. Arthur spun, desperate, punching Casimir's blank face. It was like striking stone. Casimir didn't flinch. But Lenora, just behind her brother, suddenly froze. She tilted her head upward, not at Arthur, but toward the storming night sky. Her white eyes went wide. "It comes," she hissed, her voice trembling with reverence. "It comes, for all. "Silence, you mad child!" Ansem screamed from inside. "Catch him!" But it was too late. The pounding at the front door stopped. The mob shouting turned to screams. Raw, terrified, choking screams. The house shuddered, not from the battering ram, from within. Creak! Boom! The ancient oak doors of the great hall didn't burst inward. They blew outward, from inside. "No!" Anselm staggered back, his face pale from terror. "We've angered it! The ritual failed!" Arthur, still trapped in Casimir's grasp, looked down into the courtyard. A colossal, solid black shape was crawling out of the front doors. The midnight guest, no longer bound by corridors or dinner rules, poured forth like a tide of ink. It was far larger than what Arthur had seen in the bedroom. It was the height of the mansion. Hundreds of blood-red eyes opened in the dark, staring at the stunned villagers. The torchbearer screamed and fled, but the shadow was faster. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, seizing them, dragging them into the churning mass. Their screams ended abruptly as they were devoured. On the balcony, Casimir released Arthur. The twins turned toward the nightmare they had worshipped. They knelt, arms spread wide. "Master!" they whispered in unison. The guest lifted its shapeless bulk, gazing upon them and upon Arthur. Arthur was no longer a guest. He was prey. A massive shadow tendril rose from below, striking toward the balcony like a serpent. "God!" Arthur shouted. He had nowhere left to go. He looked sideways. A rusted drain pipe clung to the wall from roof to ground. A slim chance. He leapt. His hands caught the freezing, slick metal. The tendril whipped past his back, smashing the balcony to rubble. The twins and Anselm, still at the broken window, were flung backward into the dining hall. Arthur slid down the pipe, the rust tearing into his palms. He hit the ground hard, his ankle snapping. Pain flooded him, but he ignored it. He ran, limping, staggering, for the woods. He ran with everything he had, never daring to look back. Behind him, Greywood Keep was being devoured. The midnight guest was fully free. Its roar blended with the final screams of Dr. Anselm. Arthur ran, tears stinging his face, until the screams died away, until the first weak gray light of dawn touched the horizon. He collapsed by the roadside, miles from the cursed forest. He had survived. But as he sat there trembling in daylight, he looked down at his bleeding hands, and he realized something. He wasn't cold. He didn't feel the pain in his ankle. He wasn't even tired. He raised a hand to his face. He tried to close his eyes. He couldn't. The syringe, the liquid that had splattered, some of it had hit Anselm's face, but some had hit Arthur's hands and skin. He heard a whisper. This time it wasn't from outside. It came from within his head. "We are free." Arthur stared at the dirt road ahead, but he no longer saw it. He saw black stars and dead worlds. The covenant wasn't broken. It had only just begun.
silence of dawn was deceitful. It did not bring peace, only made the eternal whisper in Arthur's skull more distinct. We are free. The voice wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, a cold, ancient vibration deep within his marrow. Arthur looked down. His palms were shredded, caked in blood and flecked with rusty metal from the drain pipe. His ankle was grotesquely swollen, broken, badly dislocated, no doubt. He felt nothing. He pressed a finger into the open wound in his palm. No pain, only a strange pressure, like pushing into clay. A horror greater than facing the guest itself consumed him. He had escaped Greywood Keep, but he had brought it with him. Worse still, he was Greywood Keep now, a new prison, a walking cage. And the guest was no longer confined, it was enthroned. The von Hesslers were fools. They tried to bind us with noise, with rituals, with walls of stone. They only starved us and drove us mad. But you ran. You carried us into the light. Shut up. Arthur screamed at the empty road, his voice ragged. He tried to stand, his shattered ankle twisted beneath him, but he didn't fall. No signal of pain reached his mind. He stood there, trembling, on a broken leg that felt nothing. He had to get back to London, find a doctor, find someone. An exorcist? He laughed hoarsely, a dry, broken sound. Who would believe him? They'd throw him in an asylum. An asylum, the voice whispered, amused. So much fear there. So many fragile minds. You would like it there. No, Arthur muttered, limping forward. You want fear? You want wakefulness? I won't give you any. He walked. He focused on the road, on logic. He was Arthur, a lawyer. He had an office. He had clients. He had a life. But as he walked, the world around him began to change. The morning sunlight seemed too bright, too thin. At the edge of his vision, he saw ripples, tiny fractures in the air, as if reality itself were a pane of dirty glass. And through those cracks, he saw it, what the guest was showing him. He saw cities built from nightmares, oceans of black mist, and in the sky, not a sun, but a vast red eye blinking slowly as it watched a dying universe. He stumbled, not because of his ankle, but because of the images in his mind. He walked for hours. The fatigue he should have felt turned into a feverish alertness. He didn't need sleep. He didn't need rest. At last, he reached a small village. People were starting their day. A farmer was herding cattle. A woman hung clothes on a line. They saw him, a well-dressed man, filthy, bloodied, clothes torn, walking on a broken leg without a trace of pain. The farmer waved, about to greet him. But as he drew closer, the man froze. His smile vanished, replaced by raw, instinctive terror. His cow bellowed and stumbled backward, eyes rolling. Arthur looked at the farmer. As he did, he felt something new, a hunger. He could feel the man's sudden fear. It tasted like ozone before a storm, an electric shock numbing every sense. And the guest within him rejoiced. More, it whispered, not in words, but in a pulse of craving. The farmer backed away, muttering a prayer, and fled into his house, slamming the door. Arthur stood alone on the village road. The hunger eased slightly.
leaving a nauseating satisfaction. He understood at last the most terrible truth. The von Hesslers, with all their madness, had been right. They were the wardens. They kept the guest confined, feeding it with their own fear in endless ritual and torment. But Arthur was different. He was no warden. He was a harvester. He was free, and so was the thing inside him. London, with its millions of souls, millions of fears, anxieties, and whispered nightmares, awaited. He straightened his torn coat, trying to hide the blood on his hands. He began walking towards the carriage station. This time, he did not limp. He simply commanded his body to ignore the pain.
Tonight's tale has drawn to a close, but do not mistake it for mere fiction. Our world has countless shadowed corners, and the most terrifying stories are always the ones that are true. Thank you for listening. We will return to the darkness soon enough.